January 17th, 1821. Midnight. Rosewood Plantation, South Carolina. The moon hung low and swollen over the cypress trees, casting silver across the cotton fields like a shroud over the dead. Inside the master's house, behind carved mahogany doors, Catherine Ashford stood frozen, candlestick trembling in her white-knuckled grip. Before her, tangled in silk sheets stained with sweat and sin, lay her husband, Colonel Matthias Ashford, master of 300 souls, and three young men whose shackled wrists told a story no scripture could forgive. The air reeked of tobacco, whiskey, and something darker, something that would burn this town to ash. This was not love. This was not desire. This was dominion twisted into depravity, power made flesh in the most grotesque form imaginable. Matthias Ashford was no mere plantation owner. He was a pillar of Charleston society, a deacon, a man whose word could hang a man or marry a daughter into wealth. But behind the white columns and Christian hymns, he had built a kingdom of terror. The three men in his bed were not there by choice. They were property, possessions, souls he had broken long before this night. And Catherine, pious, silent Catherine, had suspected, had heard whispers, had seen the way certain young men disappeared into the house after dark and returned hollow-eyed at dawn. Tonight the whispers became screams. She did not weep. She did not run. Catherine Ashford, daughter of a Virginia judge, wife of a monster, stood in that doorway and made a choice that would carve her name into the darkest folklore of the South. By morning, the entire town of Rosewood would know. By noon, they would be forced to watch. And if you think you know how far a woman scorned will go when righteousness and rage become one, then stay with me now, because what Catherine unleashed wasn't just vengeance, it was reckoning. And if this story grips you the way it gripped that town, then let me know in the comments, subscribe, and walk with me into the fire she lit that night. Because legends aren't born in daylight. They're forged in the kind of darkness that makes even the moon turn away. Catherine's hand did not shake as she set the candlestick down on the mahogany side table. The flame guttered, casting monstrous shadows across the room, shadows that danced over her husband's naked back, over the terror-frozen faces of the three young men who now scrambled to cover themselves with whatever fabric their trembling hands could find. One of them, no older than 19, met her eyes. His name was Samuel. She knew him. She had watched him grow up in the slave quarters, had seen his mother sold away when he was 12, had witnessed Matthias's lingering stares even then. The boy's eyes held no plea for mercy. They held something far more damning, recognition. He knew she had known, and she knew he knew she had done nothing, until now. Matthias rose from the bed like a king disturbed from slumber, his face flushed not with shame but with indignation. "Catherine," he began, his voice that same smooth baritone that had charmed senators and preachers alike, "you will leave this room immediately and speak of this to no one, or I will—" "You will what?" Her voice cut through his threat like a blade through rotted wood. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the weight of every silent year, every swallowed suspicion, every prayer she had whispered while lying beside a man she had never truly known. "Ruin me? Cast me out? Kill me, perhaps, as you've killed the spirits of how many others?" The room went cold. Outside, an owl shrieked. Matthias's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively reaching for the belt he'd draped over the bedpost, that same leather strap he'd used on field hands for lesser infractions than looking him in the eye. But Catherine did not flinch. She had already made her decision. She had already seen the endgame. And in that moment, Matthias Ashford, for the first time in his life, felt the ground shift beneath him. Catherine turned slowly, her nightgown whispering against the polished floor as she walked to the door. For a heartbeat, Matthias exhaled, thinking perhaps she would retreat, would swallow this horror as she had swallowed so many others, would return to her chamber and pretend the world was still the ordered, godly place it had been at supper. But Catherine Ashford did not close the door behind her. She opened it wider. Then she walked down the hallway to the servant's bell and rang it, Once, twice, 3 times. The brass clapper echoed through the great house like a death knell. Within moments, footsteps thundered on the stairs. Esther, the head housemaid, appeared first. Her gray hair barely contained beneath her wrap, eyes wide with fear at being summoned at such an hour. Behind her came James, the elderly butler who had served the Ashford family for 40 years, then Mary, the cook, then others pouring from their quarters, expecting fire or illness or death. "Go to the quarters," Catherine commanded, her voice steady as iron. "Wake everyone, every man, woman, and child. Bring them to the main house. Then send riders to town. Wake Reverend Hollis. Wake Judge Carruthers. Wake the mayor, the sheriff, the Pembrokes, the Lancasters, every family of standing. Tell them Catherine Ashford demands their presence at dawn. Tell them it is a matter of moral emergency and Christian duty." Esther's face went ashen. "Mistress, what—" "Do it now." Catherine's blue eyes, which had always been soft, which had always looked away, now burned with something that made even Esther, a woman who had survived 30 years of bondage, step back. "And Esther, when they ask what this concerns, tell them the truth. Tell them the master of Rosewood Plantation stands accused before God and man. Tell them his wife has witnessed his crimes. Tell them justice will be served in the light of day, where all can see." Behind her from the bedroom came Matthias's roar, a sound of rage and disbelief. He appeared in the hallway, hastily wrapped in a dressing gown, his face purple with fury. "You mad bitch! You'll hang for this. I'll have you declared insane and locked away." But Catherine had already descended the stairs, and the house had already begun to wake. By 3 in the morning, Rosewood Plantation blazed with lamplight like a cathedral on Easter Sunday. Every window glowed, every chandelier had been lit. Catherine had ordered it so, and the house slaves, confused, terrified, but obedient to this sudden transformation in their mistress, had complied. They moved through the halls like ghosts, lighting candles and oil lamps until the great house stood against the darkness like a beacon, or perhaps a pyre waiting for its kindling. In the fields beyond, the slave quarters had emptied. 300 souls trudged up the dirt path toward the main house, many wrapped in threadbare blankets, children clinging to their mothers' skirts, old men leaning on walking sticks. They came because they had been summoned. They came because refusal meant the lash. But as they approached and saw the mistress standing on the columned veranda, alone, unflinching, with something wild and holy burning in her eyes, they came because they sensed that tonight the order of things had shattered. Catherine watched them gather. She watched their faces illuminated by torchlight, searched each one for recognition, for understanding, for that spark of humanity that Matthias and men like him had spent lifetimes trying to extinguish. She saw Miriam, Samuel's mother, who had been brought back to Rosewood 3 years ago after her new owner died. She saw Big Thomas, whose back was a roadmap of scars. She saw Patience, barely 14, whose eyes held a terror that Catherine now understood with sickening clarity. How many had Matthias touched? How many had he violated under the cover of ownership, of law, of God-given dominion over lesser beings? Behind her, inside the house, Matthias was screaming at James to saddle horses, to ride for the authorities, to fetch men with guns who would restore order. But James, who had served faithfully for 4 decades, who had never once disobeyed a direct command, stood at the base of the stairs and did not move. His rheumy eyes met Catherine's through the open door, and slowly, deliberately, he shook his head. No, not tonight. Tonight something else would govern Rosewood Plantation. Something older than law, older than cotton, older than chains. The riders returned at dawn. They came in carriages and on horseback, the prominent families of Rosewood and the surrounding county, roused from their beds by news so scandalous, so unthinkable, that curiosity overpowered outrage at the ungodly hour. Reverend Hollis arrived first, his black coat buttoned to the throat, his Bible clutched like a shield. Judge Carruthers came with his wife, whose face was pinched with the particular disgust of a woman who sensed her social world crumbling. The Pembrokes, the Lancasters, the Davidsons, the Whitfields, all of Charleston's finest bloodlines converged on Rosewood as the sun broke pink and gold over the cotton fields. They came expecting to console Catherine, to hear of some slave uprising or financial ruin or scandalous betrayal that a woman's hysteria had blown out of proportion. They came prepared to restore Matthias to his rightful place and escort his troubled wife to somewhere quiet, somewhere she could be managed. What they found stopped them cold. The lawn before the great house had been transformed into an arena. Catherine had ordered chairs arranged in a half-circle, facing a raised platform normally used for auction blocks when Matthias sold his surplus slaves. Torches ringed the space, still burning though daylight had come. And standing on that platform, wrists bound with the same iron shackles used in the fields, was Colonel Matthias Ashford himself. He was still in his dressing gown, his thinning hair wild, his face a mask of impotent rage. Beside him stood Samuel, Isaiah, and Thomas, the three young men from the bedroom, also bound, but positioned differently. They stood as witnesses, not as condemned. Judge Carruthers dismounted, his hand instinctively moving to his pistol. "Catherine Ashford, what in God's name is the meaning of this? Release your husband at once. This is madness. This is justice," Catherine said. She stood at the base of the platform, dressed now in her finest black dress, her hair pinned with the severity of a widow at a funeral. Around her, forming a second circle beyond the seated white gentry, stood every slave from Rosewood Plantation, 300 witnesses, 300 souls who had never been asked to watch judgment rendered, until now. Reverend Hollis stepped forward, his voice quaking with a mixture of authority and uncertainty. "Mrs. Ashford, I must insist you explain yourself before God and this assembly. These are serious accusations implied by this spectacle. A wife does not bind her husband. A mistress does not summon the town to witness her marital grievances. There are proper channels, Christian processes. Christian processes." Catherine repeated the words as though tasting poison. She turned to face the Reverend, and those who knew her, who had sat beside her in church every Sunday for 12 years, who had watched her embroider quietly at social gatherings, who had remarked on her gentle demeanor and obedient nature, barely recognized the woman before them. "Tell me, Reverend, what Christian process addresses a man who uses his dominion over human chattel not merely for labor, but for the satisfaction of his most depraved appetites? What scripture guides us when a deacon of the church, a man who reads from the pulpit, forces himself upon those who cannot refuse him, who cannot speak, who cannot flee?" A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, both white and black. Mrs. Pembroke gasped, her gloved hand flying to her mouth. Judge Carruthers' eyes narrowed dangerously, and on the platform Matthias finally found his voice. "Lies!" he roared, struggling against his bonds. "Slander from a barren, spiteful woman who has lost her mind. She has orchestrated this madness because I refused to send her to her sister in Virginia. She seeks to humiliate me, to destroy my reputation with fabrications and—" "Samuel," Catherine said quietly, cutting through her husband's tirade, "tell them what happened in that room. Tell them how long it has been happening. Tell them how many others." The young man stood frozen, his dark eyes wide with terror. To speak was to die. Every slave knew this. Every slave had learned from birth that truth was a luxury afforded only to white men, and even then, only to those with power. But Catherine turned to face him fully, and in her eyes was something he had never seen from a white woman before. Permission, protection, or perhaps just shared damnation. Samuel's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. But in the strange, suspended silence that had fallen over Rosewood Plantation, a silence so complete that even the morning birds seemed to hold their breath, that whisper carried like thunder. "Since I was 14 years old," he said, each word pulled from somewhere deep and broken inside him. "The master, he would call me to the house after dark, tell me to bring wood for the fire or wine for his study, but there was never any fire that needed tending, never any wine that needed pouring. His shackled hands trembled. Tears carved lines down his face, but he did not stop. He said if I told anyone, he'd sell my sister to the cotton fields in Mississippi. He said if I resisted, he'd have me whipped to death and make my mother watch. He said I should be grateful. That this was better than field work, that this was favor. The word hung in the air like a noose. Mrs. Lancaster stood abruptly as though to flee, but her husband gripped her arm and forced her to remain seated. Judge Carruthers's face had gone from red to ash white, and Reverend Hollis, who had dined at this table countless times, who had praised Matthias's generosity and Christian stewardship, looked as though he might vomit. "He lies!" Matthias screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "A slave's testimony is worthless, inadmissible. This is a conspiracy, a revolt orchestrated by my own wife. Judge Carruthers, you know the law. A slave cannot testify against a white man. This entire proceeding is illegal. It's—" "Isaiah," Catherine said, her voice still that same terrifying calm. "Tell them your story." Isaiah, broader and older than Samuel, perhaps 25, lifted his head. His jaw was set with a different kind of resolve, not the breaking of a boy, but the defiance of a man who had already decided he would not survive this day and had made peace with it. "I'm the seventh," he said flatly. "There were 6 before me. 3 were sold away when they got too old for his tastes. 2 killed themselves. 1 ran, and you all remember what happened to him." A collective memory rippled through the crowd. 3 years ago, a young man named Jacob had been caught 20 miles north, dragged back to Rosewood in chains and punished in the town square as an example. Matthias himself had overseen it, 50 lashes, administered publicly while the assembled citizens of Rosewood watched and nodded approvingly at the maintenance of order. Jacob had died 2 days later from infection. The town had called it justice, called it necessary, called it the price of attempting to steal oneself away from lawful ownership. But now, standing in the cold light of dawn with Isaiah's words settling like ash over their heads, some in that crowd began to understand what they had truly witnessed, not justice, murder, the silencing of a witness. "Jacob told me before he ran," Isaiah continued, his voice gaining strength, gaining fury. "Told me he couldn't live with it anymore. Couldn't let the master touch him one more time. Said he'd rather die free than live as that man's, his—" The word wouldn't come. Perhaps no word existed for what they had been. Not slaves. Not even victims. Something for which the English language had no proper name because to name it would be to acknowledge its existence, and society had agreed long ago that such things did not exist. Not here. Not in Christian America. Not among gentlemen. Thomas, the third young man, spoke without being asked. His voice was hollow, scraped clean of everything except truth. "I'm 18. It started last year. He told me I was special, that I reminded him of someone from his youth. He gave me extra rations, a blanket that wasn't full of holes, and then one night he called me to his private study and—" Thomas's voice finally broke. "I tried to say no, just once. He had me tied to the whipping post for 3 hours in the summer heat with no water. Then he asked me again if I understood my place. I said yes, master. I've said yes every night since." The sun had fully risen now, bathing the plantation in golden light that seemed obscene against the darkness of what was being unveiled. Catherine watched the faces of Rosewood's finest citizens as the testimonies landed like stones in still water, each ripple spreading outward, disturbing the carefully maintained surface of their world. She saw Mrs. Pembroke weeping quietly into her handkerchief. Whether from horror at the crimes or horror at having to hear them spoken aloud, Catherine could not tell. She saw Judge Carruthers's hand shaking where it rested on his knee, his legal mind surely racing through precedents and procedures, searching desperately for some framework that could contain this catastrophe. She saw Reverend Hollis staring at Matthias with something between betrayal and recognition, as though seeing clearly for the first time what he had perhaps always suspected but never dared to name. And she saw the slaves, 300 faces, some streaming with tears, others hardened into masks of vindication, still others blank with the shock of witnessing the impossible, their master's world cracking open like a rotten egg. Big Thomas, whose daughter had died last winter from pneumonia after Matthias refused to let her rest from field work, stood with his massive arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the man who had owned him for 32 years. Miriam clutched her chest as though her heart might burst through her ribs, watching her son, her baby boy, speak truths that should have gotten him killed where he stood. And Patience, that 14-year-old girl with the haunted eyes, stared at the platform with an expression Catherine recognized instantly. Relief. The terrible, guilty relief of realizing you were not the only one, that the monster had other victims, that perhaps in some twisted way your silence had not been weakness but survival. "These are the accusations," Catherine said, her voice cutting through the chaos of whispered conversations and stifled sobs. "Sodomy, rape, the systematic abuse of power and flesh, crimes against nature and against God, and before you dismiss these testimonies because they come from mouths you've deemed unworthy of truth, know this, I witnessed it myself. Last night I stood in that doorway and saw my husband entangled with these 3 young men. I saw the shackles, I saw the terror in their eyes. I saw everything. Matthias lunged against his chains with such violence that the iron posts holding him creaked. His face had gone beyond rage into something feral, something unrecognizable. "You sanctimonious whore," he spat, his refined accent disintegrating into raw venom. "You dare stand there and condemn me? You who have given me no sons, no heirs, nothing but cold piety and disappointment? You think these people," he gestured wildly at the assembled slaves, "are human. They're animals. Property. No different than the horses in my stable or the hogs in my pen. What I do with my own property is my own affair, and you have just signed your death warrant, wife. When I am freed from these chains, and I will be freed because the law is on my side, I will see you committed to an asylum where you will rot and die forgotten." The words echoed across the plantation grounds, and for a long moment no one moved. The white citizens sat frozen, caught between their loyalty to one of their own and their revulsion at what was being revealed. The slaves stood equally frozen, waiting for the inevitable moment when the natural order would reassert itself, when the white men would free Matthias and punish Catherine for her transgression, when the world would return to its familiar cruelty. But Catherine Ashford did not flinch. She reached into the folds of her black dress and withdrew a leather-bound ledger, Matthias's private journal, which she had found locked in his study desk. She had broken the lock with a fireplace poker at 4 in the morning while the house stirred with confused activity. "Your own words," she said, holding the ledger aloft. 12 years of entries, names, dates, descriptions of your activities, written in your own hand with your own pen. You documented your crimes, Matthias, perhaps because you believed yourself untouchable, perhaps because your depravity required recording, or perhaps because even monsters crave witnesses to their monstrosity. She opened the book to a marked page and began to read. Her voice was steady, clinical, as though reciting scripture, but the words that emerged were anything but holy. April 3rd, 1815. The new boy Marcus, age 16, resisted tonight, had to use the threat of his mother's sale to bring him to compliance. His fear is exquisite. Reminds me of the stable hand from my youth in Virginia, that same defiance that makes submission all the sweeter. Catherine's voice did not waver as she read, though every word felt like swallowing glass. July 19th, 1816. Samuel has finally learned his place. He no longer weeps. I have molded him perfectly. The others could learn from his obedience. She turned the page. November 2nd, 1818. Jacob has become tiresome with his melancholy. I tire of his silent accusations. Will arrange his sale before spring, or perhaps engineer an escape attempt. The latter would prove more satisfying and serve as instruction to the others. She snapped the book shut. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Matthias had stopped struggling, his face now drained of color, his eyes wide with the dawning realization that his carefully constructed world was not merely cracking, it was obliterated. Judge Carruthers rose slowly from his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, searching for words that would not come. The ledger was evidence, physical, undeniable, damning evidence written in Matthias's own elegant script. In a court of law, a slave's testimony might be worthless, but a white man's own confession, documented, dated, detailed, that was something else entirely. "You stole my private property," Matthias whispered, his voice now small, almost childlike. "That journal is mine. You had no right." "I had every right," Catherine said. "I am your wife, your property by the very laws you now invoke, and a wife has the right to know what manner of man shares her bed. What disease of soul might infect her, what rot might spread through her household." She turned to face the assembled citizens. "So now you know. Now you have heard. Now you have seen evidence. The question before us is simple. What does a Christian society do with such a man? What does the law do? What does God demand?" Reverend Hollis stood, his legs unsteady, his face gray as tombstone marble. He clutched his Bible so tightly his knuckles had gone white. This is an abomination," he said, his voice shaking. "Leviticus is clear. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. The law of God is unambiguous." He turned to face Matthias, and in his eyes was something terrible, not compassion, not even righteousness, but fear. Fear that if Matthias's sins were laid bare, then perhaps other sins might be examined. Perhaps other men's secrets might be dragged into the light. But this is a matter for the courts, for proper authorities, not for this circus, not for mob justice orchestrated by a woman. "Mob justice," Catherine repeated softly. She looked around at the 300 slaves surrounding them, men, women, and children who had never been offered justice of any kind, proper or otherwise. "Is that what this is? When a woman demands accountability for rape and sodomy, it's mob justice? But when a man rapes those who cannot refuse him, who cannot speak against him, who cannot flee, that is simply the natural order of things." Judge Carruthers found his voice, though it came out strangled. "Mrs. Ashford, your husband's crimes, if proven in a court of law, would indeed warrant severe punishment, death most likely. But you cannot appoint yourself judge and executioner. We have laws, we have processes. You must release him into proper custody, allow a trial." "A trial?" Catherine said, and now finally she smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Where these 3 young men would not be permitted to testify because of the color of their skin. Where Matthias's fellow gentlemen would sit in judgment, men who perhaps share his proclivities or fear their own secrets being exposed. Where I, as a mere woman, would be dismissed as hysterical or vindictive. Where this ledger might mysteriously disappear or be ruled inadmissible or be explained away as the confused writings of a man under strain." She shook her head. "No, there will be no trial. There will be no legal proceedings. There will be only this: justice witnessed by those who have suffered, justice that cannot be bought or buried or forgotten." And here, before I tell you what Catherine Ashford did next, before I show you the reckoning that would echo through generations and become whispered legend in the darkest corners of Southern history, I need you to understand something. This story, this moment of terrible justice, matters because it reveals what happens when silence breaks, when the powerless are finally heard, when the structures that protect monsters collapse under the weight of truth. If you're gripped by this tale, if you feel the fire Catherine lit burning in your own chest, then subscribe. Share this story. Comment below with your thoughts on what justice truly means when the law itself is corrupted. Because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about righteousness, revenge, and the price of speaking truth to power. Stay with me. The reckoning has only begun, and legends are born in moments like these, brutal, unforgettable, eternal. Catherine turned away from the assembled gentry and walked to where Big Thomas stood among the crowd of slaves. She looked up at the man, 6 feet and 4 inches of muscle and scar tissue, a man who had been beaten, starved, worked to the edge of death, and yet still stood. "Thomas," she said quietly, "you lost your daughter last winter. Matthias refused her rest even when the fever took her. She died in the fields, didn't she? Died picking his cotton while he sat by the fire with his ledger and his whiskey and his perversions." Big Thomas's jaw tightened. A single tear traced down his weathered face. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice like gravel. "Little Ruth, she was 8 years old." Catherine nodded. Then she reached into her dress once more and withdrew a key, the key to the shackles that bound Matthias to the platform. She held it out to Thomas. "Then you will be the first," she said. "Not me, not the law, not the men who failed to protect your daughter, who failed to protect Samuel and Isaiah and Thomas and all the others. You, the ones who suffered, the ones who were called property, the ones who were told you had no voice, no rights, no humanity. Today you have all three." The key gleamed in the morning sun. Big Thomas stared at it as though it were a snake, something that might strike him dead if he touched it. Around him, the other slaves drew back, sensing the enormity of what was being offered. To touch a white man in violence, even a white man proven depraved, was death. It was suicide. It was a violation so fundamental that every fiber of survival instinct screamed against it. But Catherine pressed the key into his palm and closed his fingers around it. "I am not asking you to free him," she said. "I am asking you to deliver punishment. The punishment the law will never give, the punishment God demands, and I will stand beside you. I will bear witness, and if they come for you afterward, they will have to come through me first." Big Thomas looked down at the key in his palm, then up at Catherine, then across to the platform where Matthias Ashford stood in chains, the man who had owned him since he was 6 years old, who had sold his wife to pay a gambling debt, who had worked his daughter to death, who had treated human beings like cattle for slaughter. Something shifted in Thomas's face, something ancient and terrible. He closed his fist around the key and walked toward the platform. Behind him, a murmur rose from the slaves, part fear, part disbelief, part something that sounded almost like a hymn. They parted as he passed, creating a path, and then slowly, inevitably, they began to follow. First Miriam, then Patience, then others, until a tide of humanity moved toward the platform like floodwaters finally released from a broken dam. Judge Carruthers drew his pistol. "Stop this at once! I will shoot! I will—" But his hand was shaking so badly the barrel wavered uselessly in the air. He looked to the other white men for support, but they sat frozen, caught in the paralyzing realization that they were outnumbered 30-1, that their authority had always rested not on legitimacy but on the threat of violence, and that threat had just been called into question. Big Thomas mounted the platform. He did not unlock Matthias's chains. Instead, he stood before the man who had owned him for 40 years and simply looked at him. Really looked at him. Not with the downcast eyes of a slave, not with the fear-trained submission of property, but with the full weight of his humanity bearing down. "You took everything from me," Thomas said quietly. "My family, my dignity, my child. You took and took and took and told me I should be grateful, that I was blessed to serve you, that this was God's will." Matthias's lips trembled. For the first time, genuine fear crept into his eyes. "Please," he whispered. "Please, I'll free you, all of you. I'll sign the papers right now. Too late for mercy," Thomas said. What happened next would be spoken of in whispers for generations, in slave quarters and parlors alike, the details growing more mythic with each retelling until truth and legend became indistinguishable. Big Thomas did not kill Matthias Ashford. That would have been too quick, too merciful. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He stripped him. Right there on the platform in front of the entire assembly, white gentry and black slaves alike, Thomas removed every stitch of clothing from Matthias's body until the master of Rosewood Plantation stood naked and shackled in the morning sun. exposed, vulnerable, reduced to nothing but pale, sagging flesh, and the visible evidence of a life lived in excess while others starved. The symbolic reversal was complete. The man who had forced others into humiliation now wore it himself like a second skin. Catherine had brought more from the house, a branding iron, the very one Matthias used to mark his slaves with his initials, M.A., burned into their shoulders or thighs to denote ownership. She had heated it in the coals of a brazier she had brought to the platform. Now she handed it to Miriam, Samuel's mother, whose hands shook as she gripped the wooden handle. The iron glowed orange-red in the daylight, heat waves shimmering above it like the air above hell itself. "Brand him," Catherine said, "as he branded you, as he branded your children. Let him wear his crimes on his flesh as you have worn his ownership on yours." Miriam's eyes met Matthias's. He was weeping now, openly sobbing, his previous arrogance dissolved into animal terror. "Please," he begged. "Please, Miriam, I was always kind to you, wasn't I? I never sold Samuel away when I could have. I kept you together. Please, remember." "You raped my son," Miriam said, her voice dead calm. "For 4 years you raped my child, and I could do nothing, say nothing. I had to smile and say, 'Yes, master,' and 'Thank you, master,' while you destroyed him piece by piece." She pressed the brand against his chest. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, and Matthias screamed. The scream echoed across Rosewood Plantation, across the cotton fields, across the swamp where cypress trees stood like silent witnesses to centuries of suffering. It was a sound that carried within it every scream that had been swallowed, every cry that had been silenced, every plea that had been ignored. Miriam held the brand firm until the letters were seared deep, M.A., his own initials, marking him now as he had marked so many others. When she finally pulled it away, Matthias collapsed against his chains, his body convulsing with pain and shock. But the punishment was not finished. Catherine had orchestrated this carefully, with the cold precision of a general planning a campaign. Each person Matthias had violated, each family he had destroyed, would have their turn. Samuel stepped forward. He held a whip, the same cowhide whip Matthias had used on field hands, the same one that had scarred Big Thomas's back and killed Jacob. Samuel's hands did not shake. His face held no expression at all. He was a man who had already died inside and was now simply a vessel for something larger than himself. 10 lashes, Catherine said. 1 for every year he stole from you." Samuel raised the whip. The first strike cracked across Matthias's back, splitting skin, drawing blood that ran down pale flesh like rain on marble. Matthias screamed again. The second strike landed, then the third. By the 5th, his voice had gone hoarse. By the 10th, he was barely conscious, held upright only by the chains that bound him. Isaiah came next, then Thomas, then others, men whose names Matthias had never bothered to learn, boys he had brutalized and discarded, fathers whose children he had touched. The platform became slick with blood, the air thick with the metallic scent of it, and through it all the white citizens of Rosewood sat frozen in their chairs, unable to look away, unable to intervene, trapped in the horrible fascination of witnessing their world unmade. Some wept, some sat stone-faced, but none moved to stop it. Perhaps because they knew deep down that this was justice, terrible, brutal, but justice nonetheless. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Matthias Ashford was no longer recognizable as the man who had ruled Rosewood Plantation. His back was stripped to the bone in places, his chest bore the brand that would mark him forever, and his mind had retreated to some dark place where screams could no longer reach. Catherine ordered him cut down from the platform, but not freed. She had him dragged, still shackled, still naked, still bleeding, to a wagon, and then, in the final act of her terrible symphony of justice, she had him taken into town. Through the streets of Rosewood he was paraded, past the church where he had served as deacon, past the courthouse where he had witnessed legal proceedings, past the shops and homes of every family who had dined at his table and praised his Christian virtue. The entire town was forced to see what he had become, what he had always been beneath the veneer of respectability. Catherine rode beside the wagon, still dressed in black, still composed, still terrible in her righteousness. She had copies of his ledger distributed to every household, every business, every institution. The evidence would not be buried, the truth would not be forgotten. And when they reached the town square, she had Matthias chained to the same post where Jacob had been whipped to death 3 years earlier. She left him there for 3 days and 3 nights, a living monument to the consequences of unchecked power, a warning written in flesh and blood. Some brought food and water to keep him alive, others threw stones and refuse, most simply stared, unable to process the inversion of the natural order they had accepted as divine will. On the 4th day, Matthias Ashford died, not from his wounds, though they were severe, but from shame, from exposure, from the complete annihilation of his identity. Catherine did not attend his burial. She had already left Rosewood, taking Samuel, Isaiah, Thomas, and 50 other slaves with her, heading north with forged freedom papers and enough of Matthias's gold to start new lives. She disappeared into history, but the legend remained. They say on certain nights, when the moon hangs low over abandoned cotton fields, you can still hear Matthias screaming, and you can hear 300 voices answering back, not with mercy, but with memory, because some reckonings echo forever.